Kia ora tātou katoa. My name's Pat Snedden, and we've just heard from Geraint here a sense of the complexity and also the insight that's required if you want to move and shift and change things of consequence. We want to be a community, building a community of impact in this process, and we need to do it with our eyes wide open. And when you have experience, as Geraint has had, of the kind of shifts and moves that you have with essentially one of your biggest budget DHBs in the country, with one of its biggest communities of Māori and Pacific people in the country, with very, very talented staff and comprehensive support for what you're doing, and you recognise that you're working slower than the impact you're trying to deal with, then you have a conundrum on your hands. And hence this conversation today is largely about us as New Zealanders sorting out those conundrums. I want to reflect, just before I invite up the panellists in the public sector of this process today, just on a couple of realities that are certainly in my life at the moment, which are, I think, on point to what we're discussing today. I'm a Chief Crown Negotiator on treaty settlements. In the far north, we have 5 tribes about to be in settlement or nearly settled. It's difficult, it's complicated, but it will happen. In the course of that settlement, they are likely to repatriate to the far north something in the order of $200 million or more of settlement redress. This is to do something to, in fact, offset the way in which over the centuries the resources for Māori in the far north have been stripped from them. Now, there is a profound opportunity and a really significant risk in all that process. The profound opportunity is the recovery by Māori of the context and the resource potential to catalyse a really big different outcome for what has occurred in the north. The circumstances of Māori in the north are writ large, and they are similar to, but in a rural context, of what you face here in Kane's Manukau. In Glen Innes, Panmure, Point England, there are 2,500 children, mostly Māori and Pacific kids, in an education program which is rocketing ahead by way of change learning and the use of sophisticated e-learning techniques, where parents, fundamental to the success of this venture, with an average income as an adult of $19,000 a year, are investing $40 deposit and $3.50 a week to support netbooks for their kids to have wired-up learning in their classrooms and in their homes in that area. Now, that's a description of the recovery of rangatiratanga, the capacity for us as a people to get a grip of our own reality and change it, not by being the subject of other people's intervention, but by being partners in that intervention process. And as we look at the dilemmas that we are facing today and the reason we come together, one reality is clear to us all, that if we do not shift resources to enfranchise those who are at risk, we will pay the price of an under-equipped society incapable of maintaining the lifestyle of the present. We will need to guard the gates to protect what we have from those who don't have it and who will want it from us. But this resource shift, this kind of context that we're going to be talking about today, this community of impact, needs to be managed with a new kind of cultural competence and sophistication as New Zealanders. We need much more to ask people how they wish to change their own lives, and we need to pay attention to their answers. The need for people to take charge of their own affairs is never more important than today. This much I know from the evidence that I've gathered over the 30-odd years that I've been involved with Māori and Pacific communities. It is the very act of self-determination that people and their whānau and their ainga improve their chances in the world, inspire their children and develop tangible hope and aspiration, not by penalty, but through respect, not by forced instruction, but through voluntary inquiry, not by condescension, but in the experience of empathy that faces their truth head on. Might I just make a reflection here that as a group of powerful people, be aware of the idea of experimenting on the poor. To do so is to promote the delusion of solution. Rather, by partnering with those we seek to help, and by being in service of their kaupapa, we open a new door that must ruggedly face the truth of the circumstance, understanding that resources delivered and received without responsibility or insight are a waste of human capacity. This is by far the harder road, because the solutions are not simple, the exceptions are always present, and the opportunity flourishes only when the sharing is real and truthful. So as we talk about our contributions today, and they will be brilliant, and they will be innovative, and they will be of the hard experience of people who have actually seen a difficulty and been instrumental in changing those difficulties, I invite you to put the lens on that process, which is a lens of self-determination for the people that we wish to be in service of. Because in the promotion of rangatiratanga, the capacity to take both control of your own circumstance and the circumstance of those around you, and to transform that into something positive, in that essentially key principle, familiar to us in Aotearoa, we have some of the seeds of the germ of change, positive change that is possible in this community. And we have a room of brilliance, and we have a problem and a challenge which is huge. And we need to pay attention to the community of interest by the way we pay respect for their need for their own delivery of their own circumstances. Nō reira, tēnā koutou katoa. I would really like to invite now our panellists up today, beginning with Judge Emma Aiken. Emma is a lawyer of 30 years and a judge of the last 5 years, and together with her colleague, Judge Lisa Tremewan, has been instrumental in creating an innovation in the court system, alcohol and other drug treatment court. So Emma, if you'd like to come and take one space at the podium here. Next to Emma, and I'll invite up also Pauline Winter. Pauline is known to all of you, I'm sure. She is simply an outstanding leader in governance and in the creation of innovation and opportunity and education in this area. She is, in New Zealand, one of New Zealand's most prominent Pacific women who has brought her professional skill and insight to the very difficult issues that we are putting our heads on today. And Andrew Costa is the area commander for Auckland City Central. Andrew started his police career here in South Auckland, and Andrew is going to talk about, in the policing context, the kind of rethinking that is going on to deal with the kind of macro issues that we've got in front of us here today. These are people all in their own fields operating out of an innovative context to actually address this big issue about how do we make big positive impact as a community. So could I invite you firstly to welcome Emma Aiken as our first speaker. Thank you.
Kia ora tātou. Thank you, Pat, for that introduction. It's rather daunting to be here, actually. I'm probably the only judge and maybe even the only person from the legal profession. I'm a judge of the District Court of New Zealand, and the district courts in New Zealand deal with every type of criminal offending in one way or the other, and have the power of determination and sentence in respect of all crimes, with the exception of murder, manslaughter, some of the serious Class A drug dealing offences, and some of our more rare offences like piracy, treason and sedition. Well in excess of 90% of all the sentences that are imposed by the courts of New Zealand for criminal offending are imposed in the District Court. And a sentence imposed on an offender is in effect our societal response to that criminal conduct, and determination of the appropriate sentence requires a judge to apply the purposes and principles of the Sentencing Act 2002, and those purposes and principles include holding the offender accountable, promoting a sense of responsibility in the offender, deterring that offender and others from similar future offending, providing for the needs and interests of the victim of the offending, and providing for the rehabilitative needs of the offender. Now, the obvious potential for conflict amongst those ostensibly competing interests is obvious. And applying the purposes and principles of sentencing raises a number of questions. For example, whether holding someone accountable for their offending and deterring them from future offending is best achieved by a term of imprisonment and the threat of a longest term of imprisonment next time, or requiring the individual offender to confront and address his or her own personal drivers of crime. Are the needs of a victim met, for example, by a sense of imprisonment, which of course places the offender out of society for a limited period of time, or is it in the interests of that victim to ensure, as best the court system can, that no one else is ever victimised by that offender in the same way? And the drivers of crime in the District Court are, of course, exactly as you would expect, and they've already been alluded to this morning. Poverty, adverse childhood experiences, including violence in the home and exposure to alcohol and drugs, lack of education, employment and meaningful opportunities, and of course alcohol and drug abuse. More recently, I've certainly become aware that the manifestation of some of those drivers of crime includes fetal alcohol spectrum disordered offenders and those with acquired brain injury. So sentencing can be an extraordinarily complex and difficult task, one that is more closely scrutinised by our media than almost every other decision a judge will make. And while we have a wide range of sentencing options available, the rate of recidivism, that is repeat offending, and the obvious lack of a meaningful intervention in the previous sentence has caused some of us on the judiciary to look for better ways of trying to reduce the risk of reoffending. In other words, to look for more effective interventions at and prior to sentence. We are weary as judges of seeing the same people going round and round and round. And we've come to recognise that without the help of other agencies, and without in fact holding some agencies accountable for the provision of services to those in need of and entitled to those services, there is absolutely no way that we can be effective in reducing the risk of reoffending. And within the discourse of what is known as therapeutic jurisprudence, judges, or some judges, have come to realise that the judicial process, particularly the sentencing process, cannot be quarantined from underlying interdependent personal and social issues. A judicial process with no awareness of those underlying issues and unable to fashion outcomes informed by such awareness is likely to be ineffective in contributing to their long-term resolution. And it's from that recognition that have emerged what we call now solution-focused courts. Courts that look to identify the causes or drivers of crime for that individual and the potential solutions to those drivers within that individual's context and circumstances. And in the context of both identifying and implementing solutions to those individual drivers of crime, we've had to reach out as judges to a broad range of agencies, and we are now leading multi-agency responses within the context of the sentencing process. In essence, we are leading coordinated government, social and community responses within our courts, with everyone working to the same plan and the same end, with clearly defined roles and responsibilities, knowing what each other is doing and working collectively in a way that permits appropriate responses, but flexibly enough to adapt to the individual's move forward to a position of well-being and pro-social behaviour. We are providing, in essence, the services and support for the offender to take the responsibility, which Pat Sneddon so passionately reminds us each of us needs to do, and to turn their lives around. Unlike many leaders, I would suggest, in multi-agency interventions, a judge, it seems to me, pre-sentence is in a very unique position. And in essence, what we are doing in our solution-focused courts is we are using the coercive power of the court to coerce the offender into rehabilitation and treatment and to keep them there as long as is necessary. And we are also using the process and the judge's place in that process to hold the service providers accountable to that individual. Because solution-focused courts are all about solutions for individuals and not the application of the one-size-fits-all. I want to very briefly mention now some of these solution-focused courts are operating in New Zealand. They are all judge-led initiatives. We don't have a Centre for Courts Innovation as they do in New York City. We don't have a Ko Awatea with its vision and determination to harness collective skills and the energy of the community. But we do have a small number of pretty stroppy and passionate judges who are working in this area. Solution-focused courts are springing up in both the adult and youth courts. They work within existing legislation. We haven't got time to wait for changes to legislation. In essence, we use the judge's power to adjourn the court proceedings prior to sentence and create the opportunity for intervention. I talk about courts, I'm not talking about bricks and mortar. We haven't built any buildings and we will not. We are simply diverting a small group of targeted offenders into a particular courtroom on a particular day. So I don't think we're out there building buildings. Sadly, we're not. In the youth context, I just want to briefly mention the Rangatahi courts and the Pacifica courts. The Rangatahi courts are for young Māori offenders. In effect, it is the youth court moving to the marae to deliver justice on the marae. Young people and their families participate in the process there, and the court oversees the plan to hold the young person accountable. The plan involves the young person learning his or her mihi or pepeha and engaging in culturally appropriate interventions. In short, from a Māori perspective, the young people learn who they are and where they are from. In the Pacifica courts, led by the indomitable Judge Ida Malosi, she sits with Pacific elders. The young people sit in a special courtroom, and in effect it is an effort for the Pacifica community to reach out and engage with their young people in a culturally appropriate way. In the adult courts, we have family violence courts, where an offender is required to participate in a stopping violence program, a relationship counselling program or parenting skills program, and often in drug and alcohol education. We have a homeless court which is starting to achieve some excellent outcomes, and I know Andy Costa is going to talk about that, so I'll move on. And that brings me towards the end of my 8 minutes, I'm sure, to the alcohol and other drug treatment courts. In November of this year, we will launch a pilot alcohol and other drug treatment court in both the Auckland and Waitakere district courts. These courts are modelled on the extraordinarily successful, evidence-based and extensively researched American model. They have been repeatedly proven to both reduce reoffending and save money. And by way of example, there is very, very clear evidence that for every dollar invested in the drug courts in the United States, there is a $2.27 criminal justice return. but for every dollar invested, there is up to a $27 broader return when you look at the savings to health, social services, education, as well as justice. The drug courts are an alternative to imprisonment for adults with alcohol or drug dependency. These are people who are likely to have previously failed in treatment, and we've set up these courts because it was obvious to us that there is no real access to appropriate treatment in prison. We engage the AOD professional at every stage of the process. They provide the treatment plan, and we in essence bring the treatment plan into the court, with the court using its position to insist on treatment by using the behavioural change tools with which most of the healthcare professionals here will be familiar. It is in essence a chronic disease management model. The individual will appear frequently before the same judge, so there's a consistency of message. They will be subject to regular and random testing for alcohol or drugs, and we will use incentives to reward and encourage behavioural change, and sanctions to punish or penalise it. Graduation will come only when the individual has demonstrated 180 days clean. This is the first judicially led initiative to have the formal Ministry of Justice support, and the only reason we got that was because we went out to the community and got a huge amount of quite vocal support from that community, which I suspect left the Ministry with little option but to get on board, speaking candidly. The involvement of the community with the court and a commitment to the kaupapa of the court is absolutely pivotal, and I'm very pleased to say that we seem to have achieved it. With the graduation criteria being 180 days clean and sober, we have added also that the individual must be in work, education or training before they will graduate from the court. And we are working now with the community to get volunteers to provide that work experience, pro-social mentoring, educational opportunities and even paid employment opportunities. And the response has been absolutely overwhelmingly positive. Rotary clubs, Freemason, NAAA and a vast range of others in the community. And frankly, in an environment of retributive and punishment dialogue, which seems to emanate through every aspect of our media, these courts, in my view, demonstrate the very best of New Zealand. And they are an acceptance, finally, that the courts cannot be held solely responsible for criminal offending in this country, as we haven't got the tools to deal effectively with it. We will do our best only with the real support of the community and joined up services. But the courts can, and I would suggest to you, should be responsible for being an active part of reducing the risk of reoffending by dealing directly with the individual causes or drivers of crime. It has been said that there are no miracle cures, just 1,000 interventions of small sanities, and these are examples of our judicial sanities. Thank you.
I'm going to invite now Andrew Costa. I mean, you have the kind of the hatch and dispatch area of the justice system here at the moment. And so I think it would be appropriate for Andrew just to really talk about the kind of change of emphasis that policing is looking to in these areas. So let's give Andrew a big welcome. Thanks very much.
Kia ora, ina mana, ina reo, ina hui wha, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Thank you for the opportunity to speak here today. It's my pleasure to bring the police perspective to this forum. You'll see the title of my presentation is Prevention First. This phrase is driving most of what's happening in police at present, and hopefully as we go through you'll gather how that's the case. I've structured the presentation to talk a bit about police's operating environment and then our strategic direction in responding to it. And I'll focus particularly on issues that are drivers which will be familiar to many of you and represent some of our common challenges. In a recent scan, police has identified 7 factors that are particularly pertinent to our current operating environment. Number 1, publicly funded services in New Zealand and globally will remain under significant pressure. For us, the primary source of this pressure is around personnel. Number 2, the involvement of more agencies in addressing complex problems requires a greater level of coordination and communication. especially when agencies have competing priorities. This also complicates agencies' accountabilities for results and can lead to a creeping of the scope of agencies' roles and functions. Number 3, long-term declines in recorded crime and road toll, offset by the rise in technology, enable crime and emphasis on prevention mean demand for our services will change. Number 4, public institutions worldwide are increasing the transparency of their decision-making and operations. Police in particular are accountable in this way. Number 5, rapid advances in technology are shaping our environment on many fronts linked to offending and victimisation. Organised criminal syndicates continue to exploit the movement of people and advances in technology. And finally, the diversity of New Zealand's population, particularly in Auckland, is increasing faster than the diversity of our workforce. So Police's current commitment to government may be summarised by these 3 bullet points. A 4% shift to prevention-focused activities, a 13% reduction in recorded crime by the end of the 14-15 fiscal year, and a 19% reduction of cases referred to the justice sector over the same period. In response to all this, Police has developed Prevention First. Prevention First is a new operating strategy for the organisation. It puts prevention at the front of everything we do, aimed particularly at preventing crime and crashes before they occur, using targeted policing and focusing on the drivers of crime. Prevention First has 3 key pillars. The first pillar is about getting police deployment right. There's a growing body of knowledge and practice around what works to prevent crime through the deployment of police. The second pillar is around mindset, read leadership and culture of the organisation. I've been blown away by the gains that are being achieved simply through having a single unifying focus across a large body of staff. That's a learning in itself. When you have a clear focus and a large group of people coming around it, you can get results that you wouldn't have otherwise expected. The third pillar recognises there's a limit to what can be achieved through the deployment of police. The drivers of crime approach is based on the premise that the best gains will come from tackling problems at their causes. This quickly leads us to the need to work with others if we're to achieve sustainable crime reduction. There are 5 drivers of crime under Prevention First. These drivers are probably at best a summary of more complex drivers or that lie underneath, but they give us a point of focus. The most pertinent of the 5 drivers which you see up there is families, youth, alcohol, organised crime and drugs and road policing are probably the first 3, families, youth and alcohol, issues from which would explain the vast majority of crime. Police are generally seeing these problems at their most acute. For the most part, we're treating the symptoms rather than addressing the cause. The opportunity presented by the drivers is to work with other agencies, particularly in the social sector, who have a greater mandate to tackle the underlying causes of offending. But working cross-sector is challenging. We're dealing with many of the same people for closely connected reasons, and yet the gaps between our agencies can be quite significant. To illustrate, for the time being, I'm chairing the Auckland Homeless Steering Group, which has representation from key social agencies and NGOs with an interest in homelessness. We've had some tremendous success from it. The Homeless Court would be one example, where we've been able to come around and work on a single initiative that's making a difference. Yet some of our biggest challenges come before we even start to tackle the substantive issues. Challenges such as the limitations on sharing information between agencies about the individuals we're dealing with in order to have a coordinated response. Also, in times of fiscal constraint, there's a tendency to pull back from the issues that do not fall squarely within our respective areas of responsibility. A key question that arises for me in this is whether we have the incentives right to achieve a truly coordinated approach. We all have core business on which our performance is judged. The temptation is to invest most heavily in the things that will get demonstrable gains in the short term against those core functions, as opposed to taking a longer term view and attempting to reduce the gaps between agencies. Issues such as homelessness, which impact many but do not sit clearly with any one, are probably some of the hardest nuts to crack. And yet many of these intractable issues will need to be addressed if we're to achieve lasting social change. A part of the solution may be to consider the incentives that are created within the public sector and ensure those are aligned with the outcomes we're seeking. We need to know where the leadership impetus will come from to achieve the desired change. Of course, some issues are easier to crack than others and require leadership more than they require new resource. One such issue in which I have a particular interest is alcohol as a driver of crime and other social dysfunction. At least 1/3 of all police recorded offences are committed by an offender who's consumed alcohol prior to committing the offence. A much greater proportion of offences have alcohol as a relevant factor, whether in connection with the offender, the victim, or both. Alcohol is a big driver of demand in emergency departments, a significant factor in health outcomes, and drives demand for health services generally. Alcohol leads to social dysfunction in families, and disproportionately so in demographics where the greatest needs exist. It drives educational underachievement and reduces business productivity. It impacts on children and further increases inequalities that exist in our communities. Drinking alcohol to excess must surely be an idea that has a limited future. The reasons to change far outweigh any argument that might exist for accepting its continuation. This is an issue that should be particularly susceptible to strong leadership. To my mind, there are many parallels with the shift we've seen around smoking. The change occurred through a combination of levers applied, including particularly legal measures that shifted the social norms around it. This occurred at a time when society was ready to make the shift. To get to that point required leadership from politicians, leadership from the public sector, and leadership from the community. I believe the same shift could be achieved around drinking to excess, providing the right leadership is applied. There would be huge social benefits to flow from this kind of change, and it's one that could be achieved with very limited further investment. It does depend on those in positions of influence being prepared to say enough is enough. To extrapolate a principle from this discussion about alcohol, it may be that the greatest impact will be achieved when we come together to tackle the common drivers of poor social outcomes, particularly those that can be moved without significant new investment of resource. The hope would be that we create a virtuous cycle, freeing up capacity to do more within existing resources, much as the Prevention First strategy aims to achieve within police. The challenge is identifying which issues to tackle first and doing so in a way that's sustainable and leads to the desired shift. Nō reira, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa.
Andrew, I think that's kind of exceptional in the sense of the anthropology of crime and the understanding of what needs to happen in order to move big, difficult issues and to break them down in such a way that you can get a hold of it. And that articulation of the correspondence between the approach to excessive drinking and the approach to smoking, I think, is a really good analogy. It's one that we can all grab to, because that, if we know in the health sector, the change in the outcome around smoking was not done by the health sector alone. It was done by a whole coalition of people whose interests indicated that for New Zealanders to be more healthy, we needed to reduce the incidence of smoking, particularly around disadvantaged communities. This is a really strong clarion call for that kind of intelligent thinking, and very well put. Thank you very much for that. Now, can I invite you all to welcome Pauline Winter to the platform, please.
Thank you, Pat. You can't imagine what it's like to be sitting in between a judge and a policeman. I'm feeling incredibly guilty about something, but I'm not quite sure what it is. I suspect it's the fact that I'm not as well organised in terms of a speech this morning, and I haven't seen Pam yet, but Pam has chased me for weeks, and I tried to avoid being here today through other obligations, but she did catch me, so let me begin. Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa, i ngā mana, i ngā reo, i ngā rangatira mā, i ngā iwi o te motu, i ngā hoe whā, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa, talo whalava. I know the Mayor's not here, but this is an old habit. I'd like to acknowledge His Worship the Mayor, Dame Leslie Max, who's here today, to the Chancellor of AUT University, colleagues, friends, some very old friends and hopefully some new friends. My colleagues in the education and tertiary sector particularly, my friends in the police who I've worked with for a long time. I'd like to acknowledge the work of this initiative and of the very many dedicated people who are part of it. Ko Aratia, bringing people and discussions together. I want to give you an enormous hug, but at the same time challenge you. There are some people who we heard from the demographics this morning who are not here among us today. And I want to challenge us going forward, so that may be deliberate, I'm not sure, but to bring those leaders in and have them as part of the discussion. I'd like to acknowledge my friend and colleague Vivian Bridgewater. We have a kind of unspoken rule. We try and bring young people with us wherever we go who will benefit from hearing conversations they don't normally have the opportunity to hear. And I'm going to embarrass Luke. Luke is our young man of the day who's here. We're both sharing him because my young person was sick this morning when I went round to pick them up to come to this forum. But I can't emphasise enough what that does. Even if they look bored and they don't know what's going on. My father dragged me to the observatory, the astronomy observatory at One Tree Hill when I was about 8 years old. I had no idea why. It was a love and a passion of his. I was the only child in a group of adults learning about the wonders of space, of stars, of this universe. And it's been a love that I've carried with me all my life. Didn't quite get to the stage where I wanted to be an astronaut, but I love and adore my father for having the courage to do that for me. So I challenge you, please, wherever you go, if you have the opportunity. I have to say, it doesn't work in some of the governance boards that I'm on, rocking up with a young person. Often I've been told it's just simply not appropriate. So I think that's a challenge I want to give you initially from the outset. And I just want to acknowledge the people of this community, Southside, and it's part of Auckland that I love, that I've worked in for a long time with colleagues, and it's special here, incredibly special. The energy in the community, as well as the other things that are probably not so good. Grow our own. I was very interested in your comments. And yes, we do need to grow our own, and there are a number of us that are trying desperately to grow our own. But the theme from today that I'm picking up, we can't do it on our own. We need friends and we need generosity of others and the shared vision to do that. We're also a city of migration. The majority of people in Auckland today are not native Aucklanders. I can put my hand up and say I'm a native Aucklander, born and bred here, and I love Auckland. But those are the two things that we have to do. And we've also, apart from health being a global workforce, so is education, and so are many of the other industries that we have. So we have a huge challenge in terms of Auckland being globally attractive to global talent. We want the best people to choose us. And it's a reality that people, when they come, they choose a city. They don't choose a country. And Auckland is well positioned to be a city of choice and a city of migration, as well as growing our own. But I think we know that the challenge with growing our own, it takes time. So there's a while, we need to do lots and lots of things. There's a special growing up of Auckland that we've all experienced recently. We do have the Auckland Plan and we have one voice. I've been chairing the New Zealand Teachers Council review and been talking to organisations and teachers and people around the country outside of Auckland. And I get to the point where I say, and what about Auckland, the Auckland issue? And they all look at me as if to say, what on earth is she talking about? But the impact of Auckland having one voice, the impact of Auckland influencing central government thinking and policy is incredibly powerful. And for the first time today, I heard an ex-Aucklander, Tim Shadbolt, talking about the amalgamation of TLAs outside of Auckland because they want to counter the Auckland power factor. I think that's rather a shame in terms of thinking about it that way, because a strong and thriving Auckland means a strong and thriving New Zealand, but that's another conversation. Education system, cradle to grave. We all know that education doesn't start in institutions. It starts basically at birth. Young people turn into parents, they learn lots of new things, they're taught new things, they find mentors to help them. I want to, and I have been trying to encourage a cradle to grave approach with education. Our kids and their learning in the 21st, 22nd century, and Pat, you gave the example of what you're doing, is completely different. So then when we're thinking education, it's not the same as what we experienced. It's different. Our kids are deriving new experiences. They have new gadgets that they're on all the time. Their learning is not necessarily contained within the school system and within the classroom. It's happening all the time. And if you want to see a really great example of that, go to Point England and some of those other schools. And what's really heartening for me is to see the teachers and the changes that they've had to undertake to be able to challenge and give those kids the navigation tools to actually go and find the information, to have those learning experiences. Education has a major role to play in health, and we've heard what health is delivering to education. But it also needs some generosity and commitment. Educators, we need the very best to be in front of our children and our grandchildren and our adults. As part of the Teachers' Council review, I have been asking the question, should all educators be registered to educate? Not just in the compulsory system, but also educators in the tertiary system. Surely we want the best. I want to tell you something about the tertiary system and the issue for Pacifica. And for those of you that don't have this publication, I'm part of Comet very proudly, and it's worthwhile. There are two publications. One's generally Auckland and this one is for Pacific. One of the things that made me incredibly sad when this publication came out was a figure of 45% of Pacifica student loan borrowers from 1997 have made no progress paying off their loan by 2010 compared to 22% of all other borrowers. So the assumptions around this figure, i.e. we take their money but they don't earn enough to repay their loan, makes me want to cry. I will leave you to work out the flow-on impact of this stark fact. Ensuring our young people and their families have the right information to make the right decisions. And Garrett, you talked about the opportunities in health and grow your own. I personally applaud those who are now giving an indication of what the potential earnings are for the different types of vocational and or university qualifications. Families need that information, individuals need that information to make choices. Good career guidance, good people around them, showing them what work in today's contemporary society looks like. It's not the same as it was when we were young, so therefore the old ways of imparting career information is simply not going to work. I've worked with some fabulous people in AUT, the Committee for Auckland, the Pacific Business Trust, Te Wānanga o Aotearoa, Comet and others, who work tirelessly to create the environment, particularly for Pacific people, to be able to navigate their pathways and their ways through this complex thing we call the education system. The education system is just not early childhood, it's not just compulsory, but there's a whole system that's in place. There are too few conversations. Having people here together today with a health focus is fabulous. You imagine in the education sector trying to get people involved from early childhood right through to tertiary education. There are a number of players. It is too segmented for my liking, which means that as people travel through the system, they still get lost. They still become engaged at some point. And my challenge to my own sector is, when are we going to have those conversations and have all those different players in the room together in terms of exactly the energy that you're creating here today? Follow my notes. There was another question. What's our understanding of the greater collaboration if we are all to be successful in our own fields of interest? And very much that. I think what you've got here with the tertiaries participating in this centre is absolutely fantastic, and it's a great model that we can emulate right across the city. And I think there was a question about, is there an innovation or collaboration or improvement that has helped your organisation to address health and social issues? There's a couple that I want to talk about. One is as many of you will know, that AUT has conducted some research that does benefit Pacifica communities, and that is the Pacific Islands Family Study. This is an interesting study, and there's always an academic debate over its methodology and, you know, whether it's doing this right and doing that right and asking the right questions. But this is an incredibly important study. It's a longitudinal study following a cohort of 1,398 Pacific children born in the year 2000 at Auckland's Middlemore Hospital and their families. This study aims to provide information on Pacific people's health, including the cultural, economic, environmental factors considered to be important influences on child health and development and family functioning. It also serves another purpose. It also has a number of Pacific postgrad students working on the study, and that's our commitment to growing our own. It's one thing that Vivian and I are very strong about at AUT in terms of research, particularly if it's a population-based research. That is, show us our young people that are working on this project, and it's exactly the same when we go out to the Pacific. That's one example. The other example that I wanted to talk about was at AUT, there's one single goal from my office to the university, and that's to produce 100 Pacific PhDs by the year 2020. How many do we have? Well, 5 years ago we had none. Today we have 6. We have 2 more that will graduate shortly by the end of this year, and we've got 27 in an incubator at various stages. Why? People say, why? And my response to them is that one Pacific PhD in the system does nothing. It's too hard. 100, they're likely to change the world. They'll change the way that we think, they'll change the way that we behave, they'll change policies, they'll change processes, because they are. They're just simply there. They don't have to work day and night as individuals do at the moment. AUT's got a fantastic campus down the road at Monaco. Once again, that was a dream, and it was part of the reason I came to AUT, with the idea of these 100 PhDs by 2020. It's the most beautiful campus you've ever seen. If you haven't seen it, please do visit it. Why do I say that? Simply the environment, the pond, the ducks, the grass, the trees, the beautiful buildings, the legacy from Carter Holt Harvey. But most of all for me, it's total and absolute respect for this community, that they could aspire as high as they like. And I'm not discounting vocational training, I'm not discounting any other tertiary training that's available out here, but just simply, this was my commitment, our commitment, and a community commitment to a group of people who deserved that aspiration. We want our kids here. We want our very best to stay in the community, to be good role models for others. We don't want them to disappear out of the system and be on their own somewhere else. We don't want the extra cost, the burden of cost on a community to be educated. So that's the dream. Thank you all for your part in that dream. Thank you, Pat.
Kia ora. Now I'm just going to invite Don Mackey, who is the Director General, oh not Director General, the Chief Medical Officer of Health. No, he's upwardly socially mobile. And we've got a roving microphone, because we're going to just use the next 15 minutes or so for question and answers. And Don, why don't you take the platform here and I'll rove around with the microphone. Sounds good, Pat. And we'll interchange. Yeah. Okay?
Kia ora tātou. Just a couple of things. First, an apology from David Jansen, who was hoping to be here, but he's been called away. And I've got here, I was listening, Maureen was talking about ministers and their role, and I carry this book around, and I just worry as I'm reading from it that I might look like the wrong thing. I've got notes here for about 5 different speeches and 20 questions, so we've got a bit of stuff to go through. But I'll just do a little preamble, if I may, Pat.
Yeah.
I'm really lucky. I'm lucky to be here today. And amongst these people in this room, and I think that's really important. I'm looking forward to conversation, so I'll cut to the chase shortly. I'm lucky that I can choose where I live. This is a big world. There are many places you can be, and that ability to choose where I live and where I raise my family is something I consider myself very fortunate for. I'm lucky to choose what I do, and those who know me will know I've had this rather meandering career through a range of things. But I'll touch on four bits of what I do. I'm a parent, and that's terrifically fun, and it's terrifically hard work. I'm a citizen, and like being a parent, that involves give and take. And we all talk about this in how we work with our community or are part of a community. I'm a doctor, and that has given me the opportunity to study and learn, which brings its own rewards. But in particular, it's given me the opportunity to spend time talking to patients and people and understanding their lives very much at the front line. And it's a huge privilege that we have in health, that you can sit down and talk with people and actually understand their health situation, but all the other parts of their life that go with it, and connect very deeply and very rapidly in that sort of consultation. It's a huge privilege. It's also, being a doctor has given me the opportunity to do kind of pretty well anything I want. My mother always, I blame my mother for this, she said, go and study medicine and the world is your oyster. And I've drifted around 3 continents and 5 different jobs, so she was probably right. But now I'm a bureaucrat, and that is another privilege because it gives me an overview from Wellington of the health sector and the broader sector. If you'd asked me when I was a medical student whether I would actually be reading a journal called Policy Quarterly, I would have laughed at you. But that opportunity for me is fabulous and ties back to the privilege of being here. I could talk a lot about health, but I won't. I'm going to pick up some themes that I've heard, and I'm going to pick up some themes that I think are common from the health point of view. I think for all of our sectors, one of the issues we have is that everybody else is an expert and only too willing to offer advice. And so let's do something a little bit more sophisticated than that today. It struck me that we all work within frameworks, and I'm just interested in maybe just a little comment from the panel, first of all, about the extent to which the frameworks within which we work overlap or don't overlap, and what happens out at the periphery. And I heard Andrew's comment about in difficult times we return to our core business rather than the periphery. And I'm interested in exploring whether there's something there we can flip on its head, that actually the periphery and the margins is where the benefits are. So if any comments from the panellists on the framework question.
I might pick up on that and maybe come back to the example of homelessness as an issue that does not sit nicely anywhere. In fact, you go around trying to find a chair for the homeless steering group, and who's obvious, and police has picked it up for the time being, but it's a difficult issue. It impacts on our community disproportionately to the number of people who are in this small group. It is symptomatic of a failure probably to achieve change with people who have significant social needs. And yet, when you look at the responsibilities of each agency, it's actually really hard to find who it is that should take the lead and responsibility for solving that problem. And I think if we find that challenging around an issue that's very in our face, what other issues are there out there that aren't so visible but perhaps have a greater impact, a wider impact, that no one really owns and has the lead on? And many of these things, when you try to get a coordinated response, you almost have to come back to ministerial level to get some kind of joining up, and that doesn't seem right when we're dealing with issues that we should be able to join up on more readily.
And I can illustrate some of that with my experience working in the emergency department sometimes, where there would be a situation where a police officer and a social worker would be staring at each other, knowing that we could name the problem, but stymied as to what the way forward was.
Well, the framework, obviously, in which a judge works is within the criminal law, and I think what's been so exciting about the Solution-Focused Courts initiative is that it has worked within the existing framework. Because when you come to sentence someone, you are provided with a raft of information, not particularly detailed at times, but information that identifies all the various necessary interventions. And I think there is enormous scope on a principled basis to actually respond to those needs and to plug those gaps. And so what we're doing in these courts really is what Andy Costa's referred to, is getting all the various agencies together in one room. I mean, that in itself is huge. Having a discussion about what's the best step forward and then insisting that the individual engages with that best step forward. But actually it is all done within the framework of the Sentencing Act, which is probably one of our most liberal pieces of legislation in this country.
I'm aware that Pat is standing here, so we'll get him walking around a bit. From the floor, what surprised you in what you heard this morning?
Can I take this microphone to whoever needs it? Can you hear? Is that broadcast? Yeah.
Did people hear something?
Anybody like to put their... What about somebody from the business community? When you're thinking about the kind of heavy-duty issues that are being laid out by sentencing people, by actually looking to address an issue like the preponderance of excessive drinking as a contributor to crime, when you think about the kind of education, or the lack of it for some parts of the population, where does a business community locate itself in its thinking? What's a 21st century view of this from somebody from the business community? Can I invite... Well, you're speaking later on, eh? Yeah, so perhaps... David, would you like to comment?
Yeah, I guess the thing that I found surprising and heartening was from all of the speakers that they're not waiting for society to change its attitudes, because I think if we waited, it'll never happen. It takes courage to lead and to set an example and show that change can happen, and then through that leadership, I think attitudes will change in the community. The other thing I found interesting and again heartening, and I'd be interested in your views on how you've done this, is we are living in difficult times. It seems to be sort of perpetual at the moment, but there's a scarcity of resources, and for all three of you there must be a challenge in terms of being swamped by the number of people who are coming to you in the court or through the police or education. How do you sort of break out of the day-to-day just coping with that challenge to try and set up a new program and say, I'm going to somehow find the resources which I haven't got enough of anyway to do something different? How have you managed to do that within the the frameworks that constrain you?
In our own time, with a lot of energy and a lot of support from family and friends. Most of the judge-led initiatives have actually been done by individual judges in our own time. We're not rostered out of court much. I sit every single day of the month with the exception of one day, and that's my reserve day. I think really though, if you genuinely want to be effective as a judge, you cannot ignore the ineffectiveness of the system. And when I've only been a judge for 5.5 years, and I start seeing the same people coming through, and then I start seeing the ones I've seen in the youth court appearing in the adult court. We call them our graduates in the wrong sense of the word. They are failures in a way in the youth court. When you ask of community probation what happened to that individual in the sentence of intensive supervision, our most rehabilitative sentence, what actually happened, and you are told, well, we're still waiting for our psychological assessment, and they're on a waiting list for alcohol drug treatment, but because they didn't bother to contact the alcohol drug treatment provider, nothing's happened. And when you point out that someone who's alcohol dependent is unlikely to take the steps or have the necessary nous to actually get themselves to the alcohol drug treatment provider, there's just a blank look. So I think it was literally out of a sheer sense of frustration. We then went out and started talking to the alcohol and drug treatment community, and we became educated. The other thing I sort of realised when I became a judge was everyone expected me to know everything. It was extremely daunting. And there were two really important lessons I learned very quickly in talking to the alcohol drug treatment community. And the first was the plaintive, much repeated cry of, Judge, why do you wait until someone is on their 5th drink driving offence before you insist on them getting some treatment interventions? And the second was to an extraordinarily humble and magnificent human being who runs the CADS Intensive Outpatients Program, when he was explaining to me in the early days the difference between abuse and dependency and all these other medical things. And I'm a doctor's wife, you know, so I have a natural, I hope, tendency to understand. But I'm furiously writing, and I looked up at one stage and I said to him, you know, some days I will see 100 people in my district court. How am I supposed to quickly recognise the drug abuser from the drug dependent, the alcohol abuser from the alcohol dependent? And he said, Emma, you're not supposed to, that's my job. And I think that recognition as key professionals, as judges are, that we're not expected to know everything, that other agencies have the knowledge and are willing to share it, has been a huge boost. And the Drug and Alcohol Court, I'll stop in a moment, but one of the many spin-offs is finally we will have in our court screeners. In other words, we will have professionals in the court who, in the course of a 15 or 20 minutes screening intervention, will be able to give the judge a steer as to whether this person is likely to be alcohol or drug dependent or not. Now, we can't, you know, until you know that, you can't be effective. So I guess what's driven me and my colleague Judge Tremuan is, I guess, that passion to really do it better. I've only got, I reckon, another 5 or 10 years of energy left in me. So it's really just taking the opportunity to make the changes that need to be made.
Would somebody else like to have a comment? Yes. I think it was first, actually. Yeah.
Thank you. I'm just going back to the question, what stood out for us, and I think the focus is on prevention. Andrew, you talked about dealing too often with the symptoms and not the causes, and everybody touched on that. The causes are often so complex that they're not obvious. One of the pieces of research into the drivers of crime that interested me a couple of years ago was that the fact that the one significant relationship between youth violence was not violence in early childhood, it was lack of attachment in early childhood. So often those causes are quite obscure and quite complex to discover. And sure, there are some low-hanging fruit that we need to deal with, such as alcohol use, but while that is a cause of some of the people that you see, Emma, I'll call you that, it is also a symptom of something else. So why are these people turning to alcohol? What do we actually have to do? And I want to go back to Pat's first comments about please don't experiment on our poor people. So my comment is fantastic that we are looking at this, but what are we really going to do to make sure that we go right back to the causes and don't waste more energy dealing with or putting in interventions that actually have no proof, or that when we do put them in, we're not adhering to the fidelity of the interventions that we knew that worked originally. So just some thoughts about how you will deal with that.
Yeah, one of the things I think that comes across from a police point of view, one of our tensions is around how far do we try to go back into tackling causes. We could quickly become a social agency, so clearly we need to try and lean on others to achieve some things, and there are now some targets that have been set around the public sector that are going to hit wider than police in terms of other agencies having to contribute. So it's going to be quite interesting to see how those targets translate to action with multiple people accountable for the outcome, if you get what I'm saying. I think there are low-hanging fruit, and there's so much, as you say, there's complexity, and so many of the causes interrelate, but you have to start somewhere, and I don't think we can tackle everything all at once. And so to me it is about just starting somewhere, pick an issue or pick a few issues that will get traction, but then be prepared to be quite agile as you go along to change focus if you've got traction and something else pops up as a greater issue. I don't think it's easy. If it was, we'd have already done it. But yeah, there are some things that if you talk to any police officer, you'll get some pretty solid suggestions about where you could start. And okay, they're not researchers, but they are seeing the problems firsthand every day. And I'd say the same in health frontline.
Can I just add something to that? Very kind of motherhood and apple pie, but it's how do you have the courage to have the conversations that nobody wants to have? In our schooling system, we have children that turn up on a Monday after horrific weekends full of abuse, and people's eyes glaze over because they're not quite sure, what to do or how to do it or where to do it or why to do it. And I think each and every day, if we have that opportunity to have a hard conversation or to demonstrate to people how you tackle this, how you work, but it does mean commitment, and I go back to, I use generosity, and I think the sum of the individuals actually becomes quite a powerful tidal wave, but it is extremely hard. And I'd like to ask the question, why are we just not prepared to have those really hard conversations and confront behaviour or things that we know are not right? Why do we leave it to the police or to someone else? It's back to that kind of neighbourhood and community thing. We've become different people than we were many years ago when we, weren't afraid to go into other people's homes or to assist or to help. So,
Pat's just reminded me that the time marches on, which is always a pity when you're having these conversations. A couple of reflections, because of course I'm sitting sort of in a policy sort of space at the moment, and the parallel work which is happening around better public services, which is how the various central agencies work together. I see parallels both from what happens locally, say out at the multi-agency centre here in South Auckland, and the work we're doing in Wellington across. And the reason I've got this here is the title of an article by Ian Rennie, Changing the Culture to Build Better Public Services. It's not only what we do, but how we do it that will make us great. And I think there's a real kernel of truth inside that in terms of how we go about this, particularly how we parallel policy with action on the floor.
Can I just ask that we just allow Leslie just one comment at the end here, and then we'll wrap this piece up for a 5-minute break.
Thank you, Pat. For 25 years, I've been lamenting failure by fragmentation. And I think what we've heard this morning gives hope that the right people brought together with some mechanism to make coordinated progress forward does give us hope. And Emma is the second judge within a couple of weeks who's given me hope. I think that is absolutely wonderful. I would love to see judges apply that same recipe of innovation and working across the sector to child abusers, and we might get somewhere. Speaking as someone who's worked in this wider community for some 22 years. And the other judge who gave me hope, was Judge Andrew Beecroft, who replied to the annual report that I sent him, saying something that, is engraved on my heart now. Your program is an ultimate crime-fighting tool deserving of support. And yet that is a perfect illustration of cross-sectoral, because it says nothing about crime. What we do says nothing about crime. It says nothing about health, but it's an ultimate health promotion tool. So if we can work together across health, education, crime, prevention of, we will get somewhere. Thank you for this opportunity.
Thank you. And thank you, people. I'm suggesting now we've got about 5 to 7 minutes. There is some coffee at the back, I think, which will be coming, or is it outside? It's just outside. But do then come back promptly, please.